Hello and welcome, my gentle and of course very modern apes. One thing that you should know is I watch YouTube videos when I'm doing stuff. I listen to them while I'm working out, or while I'm cleaning my house, or sometimes if I'm having a little snack in the afternoon, I'll put one on just to amuse myself. And oftentimes when I'm refreshing my feed, day by day, week by week, videos will show up on my suggested page that just thrill me to my core. My tastes vary widely. I have video essays from content creators that I like, scientific videos, true crime videos, those videos where the metal ball burns through various substrates. It doesn't even necessarily have to be something that interests me directly, as long as the person presenting the information does so in a passionate and engaging way. So I'll watch videos about, theme parks I've never been to, or movies I've never seen, or video games I've never played. Basically, if it's got a fun thumbnail or if it's by somebody I like, I'm going to give it a shot. But one video topic that enraptures me like no other is when pseudoscientists are talking about things that they have no business talking about. I study biological anthropology as a fourth-year PhD candidate, so nothing makes my heart flutter like seeing, for instance, a race realist talk about why Out of Africa didn't happen, or a creationist explain why Lucy, or Australopithecus afarensis, was not a biped.
I am fun, and it's been scientifically proven.
I've mentioned this a gazillion times on this channel, but speaking outside of your area of expertise can be extremely perilous, especially on a public space like YouTube, where people who are experts can fact check you. I've made a part-time job out of being one of those irritating fact checkers here on the internet. And so for me, when I see a known pseudoscientist and I know what their background is talking about something that they have not the first clue about, no background in, and I know that they didn't look into it very much because, again, I know their history, well, that's like chum in the waters for me. I don't know that the shark analogy works there. I don't really consider myself to be a shark. I think it would be more like if you took a grifter or a pseudoscientist and you just dumped macerated fruits on them, like a bunch of mashed up bananas and grapes and mangoes, and then you shoved them into the jungle, the territory of which belongs to a very spiteful and easily amused, if a bit irritating gibbon. So the other day I'm at the gym, getting ready to deadlift my usual 1,200 pounds, and I'm looking for a video to listen to while I lift. And I see on my feed a shocking video by someone who I really wasn't expecting and about a topic I really wasn't expecting. This is the thumbnail, and the title is Evolution versus Evidence. Are we really 98% chimp? Now, I've probably made more videos than almost anybody else on the entire platform of YouTube about the similarity between humans and chimpanzees with regard to comparative genomics. And I've certainly made the most videos on that subject if we're talking about how creationists, especially young Earth creationists, deal with the high percent similarity between humans and our closest living relatives, the Pannons. And so I saw this and I was like, well, this is just going to be another one of the CMI videos, or it's going to be another AIG video that butchers the number, or maybe brings up Jeffrey Tompkins. And then I saw who it was by. The full title is Evolution versus Evidence. Are we really 98% chimp? Hashtag science, hashtag chemistry, hashtag abiogenesis, hashtag evolution. And it's by James Tour. Uh-oh, someone's where they shouldn't be. James Tour, on the off chance you don't know who he is a synthetic chemist who has done nanotechnology for the majority of his career. He currently teaches at Rice University in material sciences, and he is also perhaps best known in non-academic circles for fighting with science communicators on the internet. You guys probably all already know who I'm talking about here. He's been fighting with Professor Dave, a very large science communication channel that about 4 years ago pointed out the fact that James Tour has spent a copious amount of time calling the entire concept of abiogenesis and the entire field of origin of life research baloney, basically. Now, why might a synthetic chemist do that, especially a synthetic chemist who has spent exactly zero of his professional career, of his academic career, engaging with origin of life research? Why would he do that? Well, you know where you are. He's a creationist. In fact, he's not just a creationist. James Tour, to the best of my knowledge, and I think I can support that quite well with today's topic, is a young Earth creationist. So this prolific synthetic chemist who has done no work in geology, paleontology, astronomy, physics, biology generally, or any of the intersections of any of these fields, thinks that the Earth is approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and that all of modern biodiversity can be traced back to the creation of several archetypal kinds by the Abrahamic God in the Garden of Eden, and that the entirety of the geologic column can be attributed to the Noah's Ark story, which happened approximately 4,400 years ago in a big global flood, the survivors of which were just the denizens of the big wooden boat. So like I said, Professor Dave makes this video a couple years ago where he's like, James Tour is skeptical of abiogenesis, and I don't think that it's because of the science strictly speaking. It's because he has very heavy religious convictions, and he himself is a well-known creationist and a young Earth creationist at that. And this sparked a back and forth between Professor Dave and James Tour that's lasted several years since, with several multi-part series discussing with one another and debating with one another the nature of abiogenesis and the evidence supporting it, of which Professor Dave points to the scientific community and says there is quite a bit. We are nowhere near clueless on this subject, and James Tour says, no, actually, we are clueless. We don't know the first thing. Now, I'm not an origin of life researcher, but I do know a little bit about the subject, and I can tell you that, to my understanding, we are nowhere near clueless on the origin of life. We know quite a bit about how and why this may have occurred in the prebiotic Earth, how you go from organic chemistry to some of the first proto-cells. And what I'd like to remind everybody is that doesn't mean you can't be religious. That doesn't mean you can't be a Christian. If we proved abiogenesis tomorrow, insofar as one can prove anything in science, that wouldn't debunk Christianity. But James Tour is like many creationists, and he views any threat or any perceived threat to a literal interpretation to Genesis as pretty evil, I guess. This culminated in a live debate at Rice University, and after that, they went back to having these exchanges via YouTube, sort of series for series, where James Tour would make this long series about why he's not convinced, and Professor Dave would make a series responding to that, explaining why James Tour should be convinced, and why, in his opinion, James Tour is being kind of dishonest and how he's representing his skepticism. Now, one big difference between the two content types, I will say, is that James Tour is not an origin of life researcher. He's a synthetic chemist, and some people might think that chemistry is chemistry, but specialization matters in science, and it matters a lot. For example, let's say I had an issue with one of my heart valves. I'm going to go see a cardiologist for that, aren't I? Not a general practice surgeon, not an oncologist, not a dermatologist, not a pediatrician. I'm going to go to somebody who specializes in the cardiovascular system. That doesn't mean that all of those other guys are dumb and don't know anything. It means that their area of expertise for this specific problem is not as relevant and should not be held in as high a regard. Again, just for this specific issue, if the following year I have an odd mole that's popped up on my face, I'm no longer going to go to the cardiologist for that issue because the cardiologist is no longer the expert in the room. I'm going to then consult the dermatologist, and hopefully not the oncologist. I'm not going to bother a bird ecologist if I have a question about beetle speciation, and I'm not going to bother a mechanic if I have a question about the plumbing in my house. No one can be an expert in everything. We humans rely on specialization and expertise, and we're all better at some things than we are at others. That's great. So on one hand, we have an evangelical creationist synthetic chemist in the form of James Tour, who is saying abiogenesis has no support for it and the entire field is clueless. And on the other hand, we have Professor Dave, a science communicator, who creates his videos by reaching out to experts in the fields that he is talking about, and often has them on the channel to talk about the subjects themselves. But arguments from authority aren't everything, obviously. It's rare, but it has happened in science that outsiders have come in and shaken things up. They haven't overturned entire fields, not really, but they do come in and they shake things up. The best example that I can think of is climatologist/meteorologist Alfred Wegener coming into geology and proposing continental drift was a thing, which definitely revolutionized geology, It didn't overturn the entire thing, mind you, but it absolutely shook things up. So it is important to evaluate the claims and the counterclaims themselves rather than just relying on somebody's expertise. I hope I don't need to tell everybody in the audience that, but I'll tell you, from what I've seen from James Tour, I remain wholly unconvinced that the field of origin of life research is completely clueless. And also, James Tour is a young Earth creationist, so I am immediately skeptical of anything and everything he says because as a scientist, he is simply denying the vast majority of biology, almost all of biology, all of geology, all of astronomy, most of physics. It's an absolute mess.
I expect nothing, and I'm still let down.
I am skeptical of a young Earth creationist trying to argue against abiogenesis in the same way that I wouldn't board a plane that was constructed by a flat earther. Expertise should lend somebody more credibility than the average person, but that doesn't mean that you should just automatically trust something merely because an expert says it. However, you should automatically express skepticism if a known pseudoscientist is telling you that all of conventional science has this one thing wrong and only they can tell you why. Now, that does not mean that no young Earth creationist has ever done good science. I know young Earth creationists who have done good science, and there are young Earth creationist inventions out there that are really cool, and that's great. But it's worth noting that the overwhelming majority of incredible advancements and inventions in science have not come from young Earth creationists. And in fact, for some of them, if they were young Earth creationists, we wouldn't have discovered these wonderful advancements or inventions. The same cannot be said for the young Earth creationist advancements or inventions which have nothing to do with being a young Earth creationist. When it is involved in science, creationism, and more specifically, young Earth creationism, only ever confounds. It never informs. But this is about abiogenesis. The question obviously isn't solved. We don't know how life got started from non-life here on planet Earth, but we have a myriad of very interesting hypotheses with a boatload of experimental data to support one or the other or combinations of them, and we're moving forward each and every year. I see papers come out about this all the time. And I thought Dave's videos, along with the experts which appeared in those videos, did a really good job explaining where we stand on some of these models, on some of these hypotheses for the origin of life on planet Earth. But I'm not an origin of life researcher, am I? So at the end of the day, I looked at this exchange. I'm already extremely mistrustful of anything a young Earth creationist is going to say, especially if it has to do with the thing that they presuppose cannot be possible. And I also thought that Dave's side of things did a really good job explaining their case. And I learned a lot about where we stand with the origin of life question. But for my money, I'm interested once things start being alive and evolving. Evolution is one of my favorite subjects. And even though everybody has known for quite some time that James Tour is a young Earth creationist, meaning he does not think evolution can happen, he never really talked about it. And I looked. He was very non-vocal about that part of his creationism, obviously, because that's the part that makes a creationist look a whole lot crazier. And so I had to step back and say, well, you know, James Tour is only ever going to talk about abiogenesis, and Dave's got the monopoly on that, so I'll just let him handle it. And then my timeline blesses me with this, a video where James Tour goes fully mask off on his young Earth creationism. He talks about it extensively in the video, and about the human-chimp genomic similarity, no less. And he has a guest on, Rob Stadler, who's there to talk specifically about why he feels evolutionary theory, the foundational concept that underpins all of biology, is dumb and bad, actually. Is Rob Stadler like a biologist or an evolutionary biologist or somebody who's maybe a geneticist? No, he's none of those things. He's a medical engineer, so he makes medical devices to go inside people. So not one, but two non-experts, both young Earth creationists, and coming in here to debunk a subject that I happen to know a whole lot about. Come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. Obviously, I had to watch it, and I had to cover it on this channel. Not the least of which because this is going to give us a lot of insight, I think, as to how much should we actually trust James Tour with this abiogenesis stuff, right? You can tell a lot about a person when they speak outside their area of expertise, and abiogenesis is not James Tour's expertise, and neither is evolution. I know a whole lot more about evolution than I do abiogenesis, so let's see what he can do. We're gonna go through this whole talk I'm going to stop at every point that I feel necessary and tell you what I think. We're going to do some serious debunking. We're going to do some serious joking around, and we're going to have on some serious guests. This video starts off with a black and white teaser.
This is where the whole thing blows open.
This trend is actually rampant on YouTube right now, especially with political streamers who will take a little sexy snippet from the middle of a video and place it at the front to like entice you in. I hate it when they do it, and I hate it even more when James Tour does it, especially because it's got like the menacing music in the back. And because, as we will find out, this is false advertising.
I mean, the whole thing where people have said we are 90, 99%, 98.5% the same as a chimpanzee. That's only when you're looking at less than 2% of the DNA.
Yes, the less than 2% of the DNA that does stuff, the coding DNA, the protein coding regions. In those regions, humans and chimpanzees are about 99% similar to one another. When we take into account the entire genome, including all those non-coding regions that James wants to talk about so desperately in this little clip at the beginning, that number becomes about 96% similar, which is still more similar than lions are to tigers, or African elephants are to Asian elephants, or rats are to mice. I'll add too here that this is not a secret number. The 96% number was published in 2005 and has been widely circulated since then. People are very specific, especially science communicators, when they're talking about how similar are humans and chimps. Are we looking at the protein coding regions, or are we looking at the whole genome? You are not blowing the top off of this, James. Just because it's new to you doesn't mean it's new to everyone else. Tour insinuates that that 99% number is more widely circulated than the 96% number for the whole genome. And by the way, he never says that it's 96% for the whole genome. That never appears in the entirety of this video. For like conspiratorial reasons, like scientists are intentionally trying to keep people in the dark because scientists don't want people to know that science changes.
Because then we'd become wise to this, that hey, the things that you taught us, the things that you said, really don't have as much substance anymore.
And that's just completely ridiculous on its face. The fact that science changes is its fundamental component and its greatest strength. And also, again, that 96% number is also widely circulated. The 99% number tends to be circulated more because it's talking about the functional regions of the genome, which is more relevant when you're talking to lay people. James Tour asks the audience to give this video a chance, whether you already accept evolution or whether you don't want to talk about it.
If you totally embrace evolution and you think it's silly to consider anything else, okay, well, hear us out and then make a judgment afterward.
He moves on to giving Rob Stadler the stage to give a presentation as to why he's skeptical about evolutionary theory. This presentation is going to be a scaled-down version of Rob Stadler's book, The Scientific Approach to Evolution. And James promises us that he's not going to be interrupting too much.
I'll only try to interrupt you if I think you're wrong on something. I'll call you out. But if I think it needs more clarity, I'll speak up. Or if I think that people that you're talking about have gotten away with much too much and you're being too kind to them.
One thing that I've noticed about Dr. James Tour is that he likes to put this attitude out there, this face to the public, and maybe it's legitimate, we'll see, that he wants to be told when he's wrong so he can be less wrong in the future, and that he offers that same courtesy to his colleagues. So it's like if you're talking with Tour and he thinks you're wrong about something, he's dadgummit, he's gonna tell you. But it's like, I don't know that that's true. I think we're going to find out shortly, because virtually everything that James Tour weighs in on in this conversation when it has to do with evolution, he is very, very incorrect on. So I guess we'll see if he is as open to criticism in subjects that he is not aware of as he is sort of fronting that he is. And I hope that he is, because some of the stuff that he gets incorrect is like easily Googleable, and he probably should have known the difference prior to engaging in this conversation. Do a little homework, So as Stadler gives his presentation, and then afterwards as he has this back and forth with James Tour, it became very clear to me that this video is not really about the human and chimp genomic similarity, like at all. It's like very little of this video. And as I was watching, two people came to mind who I thought would enjoy this presentation very much. So I reached out to see if they'd be interested in going over some choice segments of it with me, and they agreed. So let's see who our guests are going to be as we go through some of this together.
So I'm obviously have some fame countering Tour's bullshit. So I know quite a bit about the origin of life research stuff that he lies about, and definitely some overlap with molecular biology as well. I've hit Stadler. I've hit some of the DI guys like Behe and Axe who cover a lot of this stuff. So I haven't watched the video, but I'm pretty sure I will have heard all of it before. So
you will. I think you will.
Yep.
Okay, Dan, your turn.
And hi, I'm Dan. I'm an evolutionary biologist. My specialty is kind of evolutionary genetics, molecular genetics. And my thing is taking scientific sounding creationist claims and explaining why they're all nonsense every time, top to bottom, and trying to make it understandable for someone who isn't an evolutionary biologist or doesn't professionally study genetics. So in this video, we're going to hear about some of my favorite experiments, and they're just going to be absolutely butchered, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Regretfully, this particular peanut gallery likes to talk a lot, so we did not get through the entirety of the video altogether. We had to prioritize some bits and pieces. So I'm going to be coming in here and there to fill in some of the blanks so we make sure that we digest the entirety of this conversation between Stadler and Tour. So it's going to be a little mix. It's going to be a little Stadler, it's going to be a little Tour, it's going to be a little Dave and Dan and me from yesterday, and it's going to be a little bit of me now, butting in. Rob Stadler starts off his presentation by talking about the filters that we use to perceive and digest information. It's the classic answers in Genesis, but really it's a lot older than that perspective that it's like, well, everybody has a worldview and you view the world through this worldview, and so everybody has a bias. And it's like, to some degree, everybody has a bias. But I found it very interesting where Stadler actually ends up taking this. Before he takes it further, though, he does a creationist, a young Earth creationist classic. He explains the differences between the two models, because there's only two, of evolutionary theory, so conventional science, versus the young Earth creationist created kinds model.
And when I mention the term evolution, I'm talking about the big scale evolution here, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, where all of life today came from a common ancestor billions of years ago, a single cell microscopic first life form that evolved into all life today. And that is quite in contrast with a simple reading of the book of Genesis, where God describes, instead of a single tree of life, he describes more of what I'd call a forest of life, where there are many different trees, and each tree is a kind of life. In Genesis chapter 1, the word kind comes up about 10 times. Like it does here in verse 24, God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. And so I think we're pretty familiar with things like the dog kind, or canine, wherein wolves over time have diversified to produce all the breeds of dogs that we know and love today. But they're all still dogs. They're all still part of the dog kind, and they're on this tree, this single tree of dogs. And so the scientific question then is, which of these two hypotheses, the tree of life or the forest of life, is supported by science?
Okay.
Which one has the most evidence?
my God, he's gone full Kent Hovind.
It's worse than that, Dave, actually, because this concept of this orchard, this creation orchard, is so much older than any of these modern young Earth creationists ever give it credit for. This goes all the way back to like Frank Marsh, who was a student of George McCready Price in like the 1940s. It's that deep. And this idea, like, they're so slippery with what a kind is and where the kinds are actually, like, where the delineations for these kinds are.
Are hyenas in the dog kind? What else is in the dog kind, right?
Are foxes, right? And like are maned wolves, which, you know, this is going to come up later, but the genomic similarity between modern day dogs and maned wolves is lower than the genomic similarity between humans and chimps. So we've got already this problem where it's like, how do we identify the created kinds? If it's not with genetics, what is it with?
Right.
And I also really like this idea that Rob is here talking about high versus low confidence science and the hierarchy of evidence. And he's starting with a Bible verse That's his starting point, right? That is as far as you can get from an anti-biased, relatively neutral starting point as you can get. So we're already throwing a stone in a glass house here.
And right away, there's no question about the framing here. This is a young Earth creationist framing. Right away, unambiguously, we're doing young Earth creationism. We're not playing footsie with design or whatever, right? We're just going full young Earth creation is where the evidence is. That is the claim he is making here. And if we let this play for another minute or two, he does this neat little trick where he cuts off part of the tree. And I think that part is worth seeing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Science contradicts the Bible, so it's bad. Low confidence science equals any science that hurts my feelings.
Evidence for it. And to just dip my toe in that a little bit, to just get started, I'd like to suggest that science, because of my practicing science for 30 years, science is so much about observing what you observe and how your observations teach you about natural laws, about how natural laws behave and what they do and what they don't do. And so that observation process requires a human there to be able to make those observations and to pass the learnings along to the next generation. But of course, over here on this tree of life, humans only existed for a pretty short period of time here in history. And beyond that, going back in the past, there really are no direct observations that anybody could have passed along.
Okay, I want to pause right here, and I want everybody watching this to remember this: no direct observations, because later in this video, all the way at the end, I'm going to say it now in case I forget to point it out then, James Tour says that sequencing and comparing DNA sequences is a direct observation, right? Mm-hmm. That's what he says. Now, that's going to be a problem because those are the observations we can make here. We can compare sequences across all of these groups and look at not just... Stadler seems to think it's like, do you share a gene or not?
Were you there? Did you see all of history?
It's like a binary thing, but it's not a binary thing. Either you're similar or you're different. It's a pattern of similarity in a nested hierarchical pattern, and it's the structure of that pattern that provides the testable, directly observable evidence for universal common ancestry. So,
and also the entire field of paleontology.
Yeah, right. He falls into this trap. It's literally if a person doesn't actually physically see it with their eyes, it doesn't count. And like, okay, great. Congratulations. Like, toss out paleontology, astronomy, archaeology, like, forget about it.
And toss out his religion because he never saw God making any animals.
I was going to say that too, Dave, because I find it interesting that he starts off by being like, if a human didn't observe it, we can't trust it. But like, he's starting with a book that is supposed to be, right, the story of the origin of everything from the perspective of something that is distinctly not a human, right? And presumably they would be like, well, it's even better than a human. It's a perfect observation, right? But so I could spend centuries talking about created kinds and why those don't actually work. This idea that God creates these archetypal groups and all modern organisms descend from those archetypal groups just 6,000 and then 4,400 years ago, but I've already done that, and you can find that here. I think I'm wearing the same shirt in that thumbnail as I am right now. I do want to re-emphasize, though, that high confidence versus low confidence science, which are these concepts that Rob Stadler is going to reintroduce here in a moment, and he's going to call back to this, and so is Tor throughout the entirety of this video. These are Rob Stadler original terms, right? These terms do not come from science, and you don't see them in science outside of, like, statistics, really. Scientists aren't going to be talking about types of evidence as if they're high and low confidence. Rob Stadler is comparing these two models, and he's like, how do we pick which model we should trust? And he says this.
So according to science, we're trying to answer the question, which one of these two has more evidence? Which one can I trust in? And so being a good scientist, what you want to do is take these two hypotheses, gather evidence and pile up the evidence and weigh it out and just determine which of the two hypotheses has more support.
I find that to be really interesting, and Dan is going to point this out later, because that's not really how the scientific method works, right? Like, you're not piling up evidence in a vacuum. You're not piling up brute observations. You have to use the scientific method to investigate this, which of course involves making an observation, forming hypotheses, making predictions, organizing and then carrying out experiments and evaluating results to see whether or not you can accept your hypothesis or whether or not it's back to the drawing board. But how the scientific method operates in the various fields of science obviously differs depending on which field you're in. How you conduct an experiment in medicine versus geology versus astronomy versus ecology is going to have some differences and some similarities. And that's what comes next.
So before we get to that, we should comment on this, the levels of evidence in medicine. And remember, his background is biomedical engineering and developing medical devices. And we don't have to listen to it, but he basically talks about like randomized double-blind controlled trials.
The hell does that
I've
have to
done
do with
science.
biology?
I've done science. I've done experimental evolution. I've never done a randomized double-blind controlled trial in my life because that's not what most scientists do.
Do you guys think that the geochemists who use radiometric dating in the form of basin modeling to find out where the biggest oil, coal, and gas deposits are to fuel an over $250 trillion economy, right, use a double-blind study when they're trying to figure out where to drill? They don't, right? Like you said, this is great for medicine, and medicine is super important. And Rob goes off on this one tangent where he's basically like, in so many words, like medicine is the most important science. And it's like, I don't really believe in putting science into a hierarchy because I think it all plays specific roles, but I don't think anybody would deny that medicine is super, super, super important. It's just not, it's not that you don't apply the same methodology across all sciences. It's just not something that's done because science behaves differently in different fields. Before he goes through these 6 criteria, he has something up there, right? This is the secular source that he has. It's like a big box over sort of to the right, where he's like, this is the criteria that everybody agrees on, right? The level, like the types of qualities of evidences, right? This list does not match the criteria that he is about to present to you, right? This is where our bait and switch occurs, because I don't think anybody would disagree who is a medical doctor that you can use this chart to evaluate your evidence types. I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that. I think the level of disagreement is going to start when you're using this specific chart to evaluate non-relevant fields of science where it doesn't apply as easily. And I think the big sticking point is how this chart evolves into the next 6 criteria that we're going to see.
Yeah. So we've got on his list, we have repeatable, we have directly measurable, which a lot of the stuff he says is low confidence is directly measurable. He just doesn't like to admit that.
He mentions here that black holes are not directly measurable. And so any study that within astronomy or cosmology that's looking at black holes is like indirect and thus low confidence. And the reason isn't, mind you, because astronomy is low confidence science. The reason is because astronomy supports an ancient universe and an ancient Earth, and is classically one of the fields that young Earth creationists like Stadler rail against. And so he has to find a way to fit all of the historical quote unquote sciences into the low confidence bin.
Number 3, prospective study. So we're collecting data in the future and evaluating those data is what this means. Obviously, this rules out, speaking of, things that young Earth creationists don't like, this rules out anything that's looking at the past. So according to this criterion, anything with like radiometric dating, right? That would be a retrospective because we're looking at, the past. So that's no good. And obviously that means we can't have high confidence in the age of the Earth, for example.
That's his idea.
Then we've got avoid bias. And he did the glasses analogy. You put on your secular glasses. He did the glasses thing.
Did you guys know that also comes from George McCready Price? I thought that was a Ken Ham or even a Ken Hogan original, but that also comes from George McCready Price. They are all co-opting. It's dissent with modification. They are taking the previous creationist arguments, tweaking them a little bit, and then calling them their own. And it drives me crazy. Price, by the way, is from like the first half of the 20th century. So we're talking old talking points here. And he was also a Seventh-day Adventist, which they like to not talk about.
Number 5, avoid assumptions. Fair enough. Sure. Or at least have a reason for your assumptions. And number 6, make reasonable claims, right? Don't get out over your skis in terms of drawing conclusions. Fair enough. But he then says, these claims are unreasonable because he doesn't define reasonable.
And I also think that these 6 criteria are fine if you make medical devices. Like if you're trying to use these 6 criteria for your medical device engineering, these work fine. They more or less acquiesce to some of those points, but not all of them from his chart earlier. But he's going to take this again and inappropriately apply to other sciences.
Yeah, making medical devices does not require generating theoretical frameworks that are that make falsifiable predictions. You just build shit.
Yeah.
And it better work, and you better have a good reason for using it.
Yeah.
And we have
All
to
you
be
need
able
is
to
it to
evaluate
work.
it. But it has to, right, it has to work. This is, I mean, look, we could go down a whole rabbit hole here of like Salem hypothesis and engineers coming in to talk about sciences that are outside their area of expertise, because that's exactly what's going on here.
To be abundantly clear here, Rob Stadler took a hierarchy of evidence that is used within medicine, specifically with relation to medical trials for medications and medical devices. And he said everybody agrees on this, even though it's mostly relevant for medicine. And then he says, here are the 6 criteria that more or less map onto that table. And the 6 criteria don't really map that well upon second glance. I really don't think they map like at all. And he takes the mutation of the medical evidences table, which is already not applicable to other areas of science. And then he says that his 6 criteria, that mutation, is the criteria that we should basically all be using to evaluate all science, which is not appropriate. Next, me and the boys are going to talk about this idea that Rob proposes, that no one will debate these criteria with him, and then we're going to go on for quite some time with this comparison that Rob gives as to like basic Newtonian physics and how these 6 criteria apply to that versus an evolutionary idea that humans and bacteria both share genes and descend from a common ancestor. I'm gonna go on for quite a while, and I know some of you are like, grr, when are we gonna get to James Tour? That's more at the end, because remember, this is mostly a Stadler presentation that Tour is platforming, agreeing with, and then he's gonna sort of give his 2 cents at the end, and then here and there as we continue to move through this video. So for those, he presents these criteria, and then he says about them, he's like, everybody agrees that these are the criteria that we should use. Again, he's doing that bait and switch with that earlier table that people in medical science accept, and then swapping that out for the 6 criteria that he's created, along with his high confidence, low confidence thing that he's going to talk about it a little bit more in a second. And what he says at this timestamp is that no one will debate him on this. No one will come out and say why these 6 criteria are not appropriate.
I proposed 6 criteria to determine the level of evidence, and this is for all science, not just medicine, any field of science. And these 6 criteria, I've never actually had anyone debate them with me. People generally agree that these criteria, maybe there's plus or minus 1, 7 criteria, 5 criteria, but they all seem to agree that these criteria do determine the level of confidence you can have in scientific evidence.
So that's an interesting claim right there. So for folks who don't know me, one of the things I do on my channel is I invite creationists on and I talk to them about stuff. And you could call that a conversation. You could call it a debate. I've had like actual debates with like Dr. Casey Luskin from Discovery Institute. I've had Dr. Michael Behe on twice. And I've sent out, let me tell you, for the number of people I've actually talked to, I've sent out 3 or 4 times that many emails saying, hey, I would love to have you on to talk about X, Y, or Z. You want to guess if I've ever emailed Dr. Rob Stadler and asked if he wanted to talk about his criteria for high confidence science? Because I have.
You mean, Dan, like maybe come on and debate them?
I frame it as a conversation, not a debate, because I don't like to think about, kind of the modern day debate kind of thing is not what I do, right? But like I said, hey, I'm an evolutionary biologist. When I email these, I don't hide the ball, right? I say, hey, I'm an evolutionary biologist. Here's what I do. I think it would be an interesting conversation. I'd love to have you on and talk for an hour or so. And Stadler was not open to that, let's say.
You know what? We didn't say that, no, but it looks an awful lot like that, doesn't it?
So no one has come out to debate as long as you tell everybody who wants to have this discussion no. Then yes, the answer to his little music here is true.
I would have, but he didn't want to. So oh well.
Yeah, I think that's I think you find that a lot with these folks. They simultaneously want to say that nobody actually wants to have this conversation with them, but then when people do want to have the conversation, they're not interested. And I think really it isn't that they don't want to have this conversation with people. They don't want to have this conversation with people who are competent in this subject because they know they're going to get blasted. They know if they talk to somebody who's an expert in this subject, they're going to be confronted with a whole lot of data that they are not aware of or refuse to talk about.
Especially if those people take no prisoners.
Dan,
you're very good at being kind of unassuming and more polite, and that lures them in. So different styles, but I appreciate your style.
Don't blow up my game, man.
We all watched you talk to Behe.
We did.
I think I'm nice. All right. Okay. So I have, Erica, I've pulled it up to your next timestamp here, about 22 and change here. So we'll tell me when to stop this, because he goes into kind of big picture evolutionary theory, and then he has a whopper of a segment on the best evidence for evolution coming up, and like common ancestry between humans and bacteria here, and it's just oof.
And I want to get to that relatively quickly. So mostly I just want to talk about how he sets up this comparison.
Yeah.
So let him talk for a little bit, and then we can kind of dig into
Tell me when to stop him.
Yeah,
It'll tell you if you have high confidence or low confidence in something. And I hope that this is useful to everybody as a kind of filter, like I mentioned, when you get new information coming at you tomorrow, some of that deluge of tomorrow's information, that you'll be able to filter out things that you can have confidence in versus things that you can't. I could summarize it with going back to that example of, we talked about how fast does an object fall? It's a very simple question to ask of science. But I'm saying that if you conduct your experiments with meeting all 6 of these criteria, and it can be done to meet all 6 of these criteria, you're going to end up with answers that are very high confidence. You can put total trust in what you've got there, and people will use it, and it could be very helpful. In contrast to that, I'm going to put up the statement that I just read there. This is from my son's biology textbook. And it's addressing a different question. It's addressing the question over here. Do humans and bacteria share genes from a common ancestor, right? This goes back to that tree of life. And this statement in my kid's biology textbook is very strongly asserting, yes, they do share genes from a common ancestor. But if we ask science this question, can we answer this question while meeting these 6 criteria?
So let's pause for a second.
Can it be done?
I'm going to say point blankly, yes, right? We can sequence the genome of a human, and we can sequence the genome from any bacteria you want. Pick any, do all of them if you'd like. You could theoretically do every human and do every bacteria. You could theoretically do everything alive. And you can repeat that over and over and over again, sequencing the genome and comparing those genes to see if they have shared or conserved genes between them, right? Now, Rob would have an issue with this because it assumes that they have a common ancestor. But it doesn't assume that they have a common ancestor. The only assumption that's being made when we're doing these comparative genomics with regard to common ancestry is that genetics and the laws of heritability and inheritance generally work the same now as they did in the past, right? We're making a uniformitarian assumption there. Now, Rob would say to that, you can't make a uniformitarian assumption that inheritance works the same today as it does in the past. And to that I say, according to science, unless you can tell us a reason why we can't make that assumption, if it is consistently with 0 exceptions shown to be the case today, then I think you can reasonably say, yes, you can make the assumption that genetics and inheritance work the same now as they did in the past. Now, that sequencing is repeatable. It's directly observable. These plans for genomic sequencing and comparison are prospectively organized. A classic scenario is the Human Genome Project was talked about and planned across numerous different labs for years before before the first base pair was even sequenced. Careful to avoid biases. Yeah, you use de novo assembled genomes from both of these organisms, so there's no inherent bias to it. Careful to avoid assumptions. Don't assume that one organism is inherently more related to another. Do the sequencing and run that phylogenetic analysis with no assumptions beforehand. Again, you're only assuming that the genetics works the same now as it did in the past. It's the only assumption we're making. In the same way that perhaps Rob might say he assumes you could trust the Bible as a accurate document of the past.
And genomic analysis is just one pillar, right? We observe speciation events. We recently observed an endosymbiotic event. We have observed the evolution of multicellularity, right? We've observed all these events that would be pieces of that evolution. So it's about using genetics to understand what is possible, and then combining that with what we've observed, what can happen, what we've seen happen, and then you can make extrapolations, right? This is a dishonest comparison. He's saying dropping an object, that's an event you can observe in its totality. Okay, I'm sorry, we cannot observe billions of years. So what? We can still make inferences, right? We can do science and we can understand what happened. It's just not an honest comparison.
Well, and that point that you made there, Dave, that's the crux of this, right? He doesn't want something that's directly observable. He wants something that's directly observable in its totality, as you just said. But this is going to disqualify the majority of science, right?
And all of his beliefs also.
And all of his beliefs also, yeah. And I'll add, I mean, so with our comparison between humans and bacteria and their common ancestry, like they match, they meet all 6 of those criteria, even though those criteria aren't appropriate for this specific, evaluation of high versus low confidence science. They still meet all that criteria. And so does every other aspect of science. It depends on how you phrase the question, which is where I think he's being, a little sneaky here with how he's setting this up. You can do this with geology. You can do this with paleontology, right? If I make a prediction in paleontology of where I'm going to find a specific fossil, I can look for the characteristics that define a given geologic site, and I can repeat that same process at other sites. I can directly observe as I'm excavating, the organism in question, right? I can set out my prospective study beforehand. I cannot have any biases of what I expect to find, although I can make I find that to be a weird portion of this because you take it as well.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Is we have these 6 criteria here for what constitutes high confidence versus low confidence science, and he expounds upon these in his book, The Scientific Approach to Evolution, which I have sitting somewhere back there. I have that book sitting there with my scribblings all in the margins. A phrase that is completely absent from that book. You do not find the phrase or description of the concept of hypothesis testing in that book. It's like if the actual process of science, as most scientists practice it, does not exist to him. So when we have this question, do humans and bacteria share genes from a common ancestor? What we're doing is we're generating a hypothesis. And the way you test a hypothesis is you make specific predictions and then you prospectively, right? That's the prospective aspect to it. It doesn't matter if the data, if the event happened in the past, the fact that you set up the question and then afterwards are going to collect the data, that's the prospective aspect to it. And then we can go out and see, do the data match the predictions? If humans and bacteria share a common ancestor this many billion years ago, here's what we expect to see in their respective genomes. Do we see those things? And in this way, it's prospective, it's directly observable, it's repeatable, because every sequence comparison you make is its own observation, it's its own test. You could do different species of apes, you could do different species of bacteria, you could get fungi in on the act, right? You could just keep adding to that data set.
Same with predicting transitional forms and then finding them in paleontology, right? It doesn't matter that they died millions of years ago. We're predicting them now and then finding them, which substantiates the prediction that we made, that these forms should have existed. That's it.
Well, and we can go ahead.
No, I just want to make sure you guys are getting the same read on this as I am. When I read these 6 criteria, they almost seem to suggest that making a prediction or having a hypothesis beforehand is actually like a negative. Right? Having a prospective study is good, but having any biases or assumptions, which are implicitly, because of the human condition, a part of making a hypothesis, are bad things. So it's like, I don't know how that's supposed to work with the scientific method. Like, it seems like this bucks science in a Baconian sense.
Yeah, it's not good. So let's play a little bit more. There's a couple more minutes in this bit on the human bacteria thing, and there's something important there that I really want to point out, because he is not aware of an experiment that actually directly observes and demonstrates the thing that he says is an assumption or is, not directly observed. So let's just let him go for another minute.
Repeatably? In other words, can we repeatedly go into the lab with an organism and watch it evolve into bacteria and into humans? And
can we watch a bacteria
seeing
evolve
that we
into a
have
human?
repeatedly made humans and bacteria from it. And of course, that can't be done. It's just simply not possible.
Can you pause really quick? I want to add one point here, right? We can observe right now evolution in the lab, and we can also observe right now tectonic plates moving at the scale of a fingernail growing, right? We watch this happen. We can look at seafloor spreading in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. We can use GPS to do it. But by Rob's logic, because we can't observe those continents going back to a supercontinent in the past, which is something that creationists propose happened at a rate of at race car speeds, that the continents move from their Pangea position during Noah's flood to their current position, which requires them to move it at like 70 miles an hour. It's
I
nuts.
didn't know that.
Right?
That's hilarious.
They do. Yeah. And in fact, some of them propose that they formed supercontinents and broke up multiple times during the year of Noah's flood. It's actually,
Same with their hyper rapid speciation after Noah's Ark.
Same with
idea.
that. And Dave, that's an important point too, because they require this rapid speciation as well. But to Rob, who just earlier says that we know that dogs descend from wolves, well, we didn't observe that happening in a lab, right? We didn't watch it happen in a lab. We didn't watch dogs descend from a prototypical dog kind created at creation, and yet he would propose that all of these dogs have a common ancestor. So that's, you're disqualifying all of the evidence that you also accept just on hyper super fast forward.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Can it be directly observed? I kind of mentioned already, you can't observe this happening. Certainly nobody ever witnessed this happening. Can it be studied prospectively? Well, it's kind of the same answer. You can't go into the lab and do that. In fact, it's an extraordinarily retrospective study, if anything. Can you avoid bias when you try to answer this question? I think this question is just ripe, full of bias. People come at.
I just want to appreciate the fact that he started that phrase with the words "I think." I just want to appreciate that.
What I wanted to do if you're going to edit this in post, can you put in that red box, God created all life?
Yes.
And then just let it play with that in that box and see what a fucking hypocrite this douchebag
It works
is.
exactly the same.
It works
Perfect.
exactly the same way.
And of course, that can't be done. It's just simply not possible. Can it be directly observed? I kind of mentioned already, you can't observe this happening. Certainly nobody ever witnessed this happening. Can it be studied prospectively? Well, it's kind of the same answer. You can't go into the lab and do that. In fact, it's an extraordinarily retrospective study, if anything. Can you avoid bias when you try to answer this question? I think this question is just ripe, full of bias. People come at this with a very strong answer already before they even consider the science. There's plenty of opportunity for bias here. And in fact, I think the bias can swamp what the evidence actually has to say, because the evidence is pretty quiet here. And number 5, are we careful to avoid assumptions? I think this entire statement is based on an assumption. That isn't proven, again, because we haven't been able to observe it or test it, but it's an assumption. And so I think the entire statement is based upon an assumption that they're not stating up front. And number 6, overstated claims. We already kind of talked about that. This has no kind of hedging language, anything in it. It's exuding confidence that actually doesn't exist. So this statement belongs way over here on the left in the very low confidence bin because it fails all 6 of these criteria.
I mean,
That sucks.
so we continue through at a breakneck pace, and by breakneck I mean glacial, because they're getting a lot wrong and we keep having to stop and elaborate. So here's some more of that.
I just need to butt in with one little thing for Rob. Rob, if you see this, I want to ask you, if you were to ask your average evolutionary biologist what the strongest evidence is for human bacteria common ancestry, what do you think they would say? Like, I just would love to know Rob's answer to that question. I would love to know what he thinks we think the best evidence is. I'm so curious.
Well, Dan,
Are we careful to
later he's going to call upon the king of evolutionary biology, Richard Dawkins, to tell us what the best evidence
That's
is.
true.
Oh, our modern prophet.
when we get there, it's funny because Dawkins actually gives a good answer to that question, and Stadler misunderstands it.
He does.
But Dawkins actually gives what similar to what I would give as the answer. Or Stadler interprets it as the wrong thing because he doesn't know what it means. Actually, here we go through. All of the things are bad for bacteria stuff. He says none of them apply. Okay.
Overstated claims is the last thing he says there, which is that he thinks that the idea that it's too grand of a claim, right? Like, see, Rob would be like, you can't say the universe is expanding. That's too grand of a claim. You can only make claims about balls falling and about, God creating the earth in 6 literal days. So those are the only 2 things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here, let's jump to 20. We got like 26:45-ish is where we're going to get into the best evidence here, right about 26, somewhere in here. I do want to say he does mention earlier in the part that we skipped through because we don't need to listen to another 2 minutes of him. Is he says that there's an assumption that when you have sequence similarity, he says this in an incorrect way, but what he was saying is we assume when you have sequence similarity that means common ancestry. Basically, he's saying phylogenetics is based on the assumption of common ancestry. That's wrong because there's actually an experiment from 1991 where what they did, it's a beautiful experiment. It's Hillis et al. 1991, something with a known phylogeny where they experimentally generated different populations and then sequenced just the tips, right? The derived populations, and then reconstructed the phylogenetic tree using a number of different techniques, showing that the phylogenetic reconstruction matched the known history. So it's not actually just an artifact of similarity.
So I'm glad that you say that, Dan, but I want to add to this too. It's also just never been the case that organisms that are more like looking at the full genome, that share more genomically, are less similar or are less closely related, than organisms that are not as similar genomically. Like if you sequence the genomes of you and your sibling and your cousin, and you do that for every single person on the planet in triads like that, in every single case, with no exception that I am aware of, the siblings are going to share more genomically than any of them do with the cousin, right? We know that genomic similarity equates to relatedness, and everybody on the planet accepts that works within a species, and everybody on the planet accepts that works like even within species that are, appeal to the common sense as being closely related, like as Sadler said earlier, the canines, right? This only stops being the case when it starts including things that they don't like that violate those assumptions that they make that, humans are related to other apes. And the problem with this is there has never been a single data point or a single biological or genetic phenomena that they can point to that is the stopgap where this genomic similarity means relatedness means descent stops. They don't have it.
I love to point this out. Yeah, I always do this, right? What is a paternity test? How does it work? Genomic similarity. Okay, so can you figure out who your dad is from a paternity test? Can he figure out who his dad is and his dad and his dad and his dad? Okay, how many generations before that doesn't work anymore? And they just go, what do you mean?
Exactly.
I don't know. Right.
And they'll even be like, you can do it with dog breeds. They'll accept that you can do it with cow breeds or with plant, domestic plant breeds or with all the different types of dogs. This only becomes a problem when it is revealed with glorious detail, and has been within the past 3 weeks because the complete ape genomes came out, that humans are more similar to chimps and chimps are more similar to humans than either is to a gorilla. And it does not matter which part of the genome you're looking at. It works for the full genome, not taking into account any types of like the nature of each given mutation. It works with protein coding regions, and it works with the full genome when taking into consideration the types of mutations. There
even
is
all the junk DNA, which definitely exists.
even all the junk DNA, which definitely
we'll
exists.
Get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there. Okay, continue. Sorry.
Okay, so I think what we ought to do is let this play for like 2.5 minutes. We'll get to the end of the Dawkins clip, and that's like a nice little self-contained chunk.
Tree of life. What's the best evidence we have to support this? And if you look at biology textbook or you look at any kind of media on this topic, books by Richard Dawkins or anyone else in this area, generally they'll categorize the evidence into these 4 categories. I think we're all familiar with the fossil record. They claim that is in support of this tree of life. Geographic distribution, it's a topic like why don't we have penguins here in Minnesota? Why are animals distributed around the world the way they are? Vestigial organs like your appendix, probably familiar with that, is seen to be evidence in favor of this tree of life. And then comparing different life forms, that also involves the statement I just made, but it's about saying, like, my arm has one long bone in the humerus, and then it has two long bones below the elbow, and then 5 fingers. Well, it turns out that reptiles and dogs and bats all have that same arrangement in their appendage. And so because they have the same arrangement, that suggests that we came from a similar common ancestry. And just to summarize this a little more clearly, I'm gonna phone a friend here and bring up a short video from Richard Dawkins, where he is asked this same question: what's the best evidence we have for evolution?
Out of all the evidence used to support the theory of evolution, what would you say is the strongest, most irrefutable single piece of evidence in support of the theory?
There's an enormous amount of evidence from all sorts of places, and it's hard to pick one strand which is more important than any other. There's fossils, there's the evidence from geographical distribution, there's the evidence from vestigial organs. I think, to me, perhaps the most compelling evidence is comparative evidence from modern animals, particularly biochemical comparative evidence, genetic, molecular evidence.
Oh, we got a little James Tour infomercial here, so we'll skip. And
Look at young James.
This whole video is pockmarked with like 2 or 3 separate times where James comes on and he's like, "Do you doubt the evidence behind the resurrection?
He's
Email
pumping it
me
up there.
at jamestour.com."
Well,
and
that's been the case for years. Yeah, he always.
I didn't know that. I was blindsided.
If you don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, email me and I'll have a one. He does this. You can email him. I mean, I couldn't, but somebody who doesn't know could email him, and he'll have a 1-hour Zoom call to try to convince you about Jesus' resurrection. You guys should try it.
Should totally do that.
Well, can I just say too, for anybody who might be listening, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to theistic evolutionists, to religious people who accept science. I love those guys. I have no beef with them whatsoever.
Yeah.
You guys can believe whatever you want to believe. But I just want to say to those of you out there who might be considering talking to James Tour about this, given the way that he has treated the science, why should anybody trust him on how he treats the historical evidence, like that he proposes works for the resurrection? Why should you trust him? I mean, he's been shown time and time again to not be representing the case as it is, because he simply won't take the time to look into a lot of these topics that he makes very grandiose claims on. I mean, I'm talking specifically about how he's going to swallow this entire presentation hook, line, and sinker with regard to Stadler finding evolution to be non-convincing, and it's very disconcerting to me.
People should just inundate him with these requests and then not turn their camera on for the Zoom call and just like leave. And then he can just have like hour after hour of these scheduled Zooms with nobody listening and just eat up all his time. I think it'd be pretty funny.
So when we come back from the infomercial, Stadler's going to do a little wrap up with this Dawkins clip, and he's going to get something extraordinarily wrong. So we'll play this just a little bit, and then we can talk about this strongest evidence for evolution segment here.
In everything. My faith in Jesus Christ means.
Thought we were through.
We heard it directly from him. This is the evidence he has. And what is the best form of evidence he's got? And that would be a comparison of life forms, comparison of the genetic similarity between life forms is the best evidence he's got. The problem is that the statement that we just analyzed rather carefully here, this statement is about comparing life forms, finding similar genes between humans and bacteria. And we just went through that and determined that it meets none of these 6 criteria for high confidence. In fact, it's the lowest of low confidence. And yet, Richard Dawkins says that is the best, the most compelling evidence that I got.
Okay. Here's where Stadler is screwing up here. And I'm going to attribute this to the fact that his background is biomedical engineering, not like evolutionary biology or genomics or phylogenetics or anything like that. But he is not talking about the same thing that Dawkins is talking about here, okay? He's looking at this statement that's up in the corner there talking about how humans and bacteria share similar genes, right? Like we code for ribosomes, they code for ribosomes. We code for cytochrome C oxidase, they code for cytochrome C oxidase, right? We share similar genes because the common ancestor for all cellular life had those same genes. That is not what Dawkins was talking about in that clip. Dawkins saying that the strongest evidence for universal common ancestry, right, evolution writ large, is in molecular comparisons. It's in genomic comparisons across many different species, and it's not just do you have the same genes. It's what's the pattern of similarity across all those different groups, right? So all the mammals are more similar to each other than they are to the non-mammalian chordates, but all the chordates are more similar to each other than they are to all of the members of Spiralia, right? Another clade of animals. All the animals are more similar to each other than they are to any of the plants. It's a nested hierarchical pattern. And the important thing with this is that this pattern serves two functions here. One, it's a specific prediction of evolutionary theory, right? If everything is related through a common ancestor at some point billions of years ago, we predict this nested hierarchical pattern of similarity. And second, this is explicitly impossible under a separately created paradigm, right? Where each individual, right, you have your forest of life rather than your tree of life. Each individual kind since creation is evolving on its own, right? So if you look within the mammals, for example, right, you can however many kinds you have within the mammals, you're going to get a nested hierarchy within each kind because they share a real evolutionary history in the created model, right? They get off the ark and then everyone's descended from that. There's a real evolutionary history there. But across the dogs and the cats and the bears and the seals and the whales, there's no shared history. So the variation that's going to accumulate in those different lineages is uncorrelated with each other. So there's no reason that the dogs and the cats and the bears should be closer to each other than any of them are to the whales or the rodents. It should all be intermixed because mutations are just happening in all of these different groups. And this is true even if you assume they start identical to each other or they start with a built-in nested pattern. Right. So it looked like it at creation. And then through all the speciation, just mutations and stuff have happened. And you don't have to take my word for it. There's papers that have evaluated this, that have actually calculated the probabilities of family level creation, species level creation versus common ancestry, and found that, you can't get the pattern we have with separate creation. That's the evidence that Dawkins is talking about.
So if I may add to that, Dan, that nested hierarchy holds in the functional regions of the genome, right? Protein coding stuff.
Yep.
And it also holds in the non-functional regions of the genome. So that's the key, because they can appeal to common design if it was just in the functional region. They could say, well, they're doing different functions, so of course they look the same. Why is it in the parts of the genome that don't do anything, though, you guys? And here's an additional problem with this. There are creationists who have in the past proposed that the whole genome is functional, but they have backtracked on that because we can knock out massive portions of the genome in, like, mice, for example. You can do mega-base deletions in mice, and they can reproduce and have kids, and then their kids can have kids, right? We know that you can knock out portions of the genome and that some portions of it do not seem to do anything. So while we may disagree with creationists on, the truth is the truth, which we'll get there, but we disagree with them on the portion of the genome that is functional. But nobody thinks that the whole thing is functional, right? And so there's no reason to suggest that those non-functional regions should also form this nested hierarchy.
Those parts were put there by Satan to test your faith.
To trick you.
And we could even go further than that. It doesn't have to be a functional, non-functional thing. We can just directly document the parts of the genome that are not subject to purifying selection. Whether they're functional or not, they just mutate into whatever they're going to mutate into. And those regions, things like endogenous retroviruses, for example, they resolve the same nested hierarchy. There's this wonderful paper where you resolve the primates and all their individual clades, and then you get the rodents and all their clades, and it's just based on endogenous retroviruses, nothing else. That's impossible on the creation model.
Yeah, it's a little bit of common ancestry, but not a lot. That's all he wants.
Yeah,
can I
just enough.
Can I share my screen really quick? Because I just want to make a point here.
I think you're in charge of the screen.
Oh my God, you've been the one who's been doing. You've been the one who's been doing all this stuff for so long. Okay, I'm going to be brief on this, but I think this is important because for those of you out there, of these 4 things, which I don't know anybody who's going to point to vestigial organs at this point in time and say that's one of the 4 best evidences for evolution. But I do agree that the fossil record, geographic distribution, and comparison of life forms, both in gross morphology and in their genomes, are excellent support for the idea as the foundation of biology. And to that point, I would really like to just, you mentioned it earlier, Dan, but it was really funny because I already had it pulled up. There's this paper that I love, and it's called Statistical Evidence for Common Ancestry, Application to Primates. And the reason why I love this paper is because it specifically tests the creationist model of separate ancestry, and it specifically compares it to the evolutionary predictions, and it specifically does it with the one group that they cannot have common ancestry in, which is humans to the rest of the primates, and it specifically compares biogeographic evidence, fossil evidence, and genomic sequencing. And I would just like to read you guys an excerpt from it.
That sounds pretty high confidence to me.
It's so good.
Since Darwin, biologists have come to recognize that the theory of descent from common ancestry, CA, is well supported by diverse lines of evidence. However, while the qualitative science is overwhelming, we also need formal methods for quantifying the evidential support for common ancestry over alternative hypotheses of separate ancestry. In this article, we just explore a diversity of statistical methods using data from primates. We focus on 2 alternatives to common ancestry: species-level separate ancestry and family-level separate ancestry. We implemented statistical tests based off of morphological, molecular, and biogeographic data and developed 2 new methods. One that tests for phylogenetic autocorrelation while correcting for variation due to confounding ecological traits, and a method for examining whether fossil taxa have fewer derived differences than living taxa. We overwhelmingly rejected both species and family separate ancestry with infinitesimal p-values. We compare these results with those from 2 companion papers, which also found tremendously strong support for common ancestry of all primates, and discuss future directions and general philosophical issues that pertain to statistical testing of historical hypotheses, such as common ancestry. And when I say that the p-values are infinitesimal, they give you specific comparisons here. They say you are more likely to draw the same atom twice in a row. I can't remember if it's with replacement. In the entire universe, you can pick an atom at random, and you're more likely to get that same atom twice in a row than get this signal if common ancestry is not the reason for this nested hierarchy that we see within primates.
Oh, stop with your quantitative precision.
This is directly this is like the exact thing that you would need to prove wrong if you were a young Earth creationist, and it was blown to smithereens in this paper and in numerous others. So Dan, I'll give it back to you now.
Okay, here we go.
I just like that paper.
I think you have to put it up.
Oh God, I have to scroll down. It was hidden. Sorry. I'm new to this.
It doesn't get any better than that.
Perfect timing.
Thanks, Rob.
I concur, Rob. It doesn't get better than that.
That's a fun one.
You can see you can't write it like that. All right.
So Rob Stadler kind of just hand waves all of the lines of evidence that he has presented, and I guess that just includes all the minutia of those lines of evidence. And he kind of just throws a line in like, I know I didn't get into any of these subjects as deep as I would want to.
So I didn't go through all the details about the fossil record and geographic distribution and all that, but it's in the book.
And you didn't go over the evidence at all for things like the fossil record or geographic distribution or vestigial structures or really the comparison of organisms at the genomic level. But I guess if it's all in the book, it isn't.
But all of those forms of evidence, when you compare it against these 6 criteria, they fail. Every one of these criteria. All of this stuff is very low confidence evidence. And it surprises me that our children aren't given consideration of that in schools. And they're basically just fed this as the only evidence that there is, and it's overwhelmingly supporting this tree of life.
One, that list of criteria is not the list that all of science has agreed upon. It is the list that Rob Stadler has put out there based off of his area of science. 2, as we already discussed, none of those lines of evidence, not the fossil record, not geographic distribution, not vestigial structures, and not the comparison of organisms, especially with consideration to their nested hierarchical pattern, fail those 6 criteria. And 3rd, Rob Stadler's starting position, being religious as it is and being rather presuppositionalist as it is does fail those 6 criteria. So that would actually be the reason, Rob, as to why we teach that evolutionary theory is so robustly supported, because in fact it is by any relevant line of data within all of biology, geology, paleontology, etc., and why we don't teach young earth creationism, which fails at all of them.
So we're left to ask, is there any high confidence evidence for evolution? Is there anything out there that's better than this?
All of what he just said is high confidence evidence for evolution by his own criteria, just reminding everybody of that. But he is going to use this as a segue to talk about the Lenski long-term evolution experiment. The Lenski long-term evolution experiment is an experiment where we have been watching E. coli bacteria, specifically 12 different groups of them, 12 lineages, I guess you should say, across over 30 years to observe their evolution in a controlled environment.
So, Erica, the next big chunk in your thing is up to 36 minutes. It's the Lenski stuff with the citrate. So
yeah, let's do the Lenski stuff.
Let's do the Lenski stuff, because as a Lenski experiment aficionado, so he goes through this long-term evolution experiment. We're evolving E. coli in an environment where they run out of food partway through each day. So each day they start with enough food, they run out, so they have to compete. We've been doing this since almost as long as I've been alive. And so they're up to over 80,000. It's more than that at this point. And we found some really interesting things with this experiment, and we don't need to hear the whole explanation, but we could just go to the relevant part on the citrate part here.
So if I may, Dan, while you're doing that, I'm just so everybody out there knows who doesn't want to watch this entire video, and I don't blame you. What Rob has done here is he said, those 4 lines of evidence that we just looked at, we don't care about that. He's like, it's too low confidence, so we don't even need to consider it. He's like, but there is a high confidence experiment, a few high confidence experiments that we can look to evaluate evolution. And then he goes into examples of those, the first of which is this Lenski.
Only microevolution, though. Only microevolution.
Only microevolution, folks.
Well, Tor is very specific about the difference later, Dave. Don't worry.
So I'm going to have to, there's a specific claim he makes about this trait that I want to find, and we'll get there.
The actual genetic information came out about what had changed.
Okay, so the story, I hit the exact point. This is perfect. So the story here is, in this experiment, one of the 12 lines of bacteria evolved the ability to eat another nutrient in that environment. And then the fitness for that line, the population density went way up because they had more food available. And that was like a big biochemical change. So take it away, Rob.
After 33,000 generations. So Richard Lenski's lab, he had these 2 papers come out, and these 2 papers showed exactly what genetic changes had happened. And it turned out that the ability to metabolize citrate involved duplicating one existing gene, simply took a gene and made another copy of it, put it down somewhere else in the DNA. And then another gene, the bacteria lost control of it. It lost its ability to regulate that gene. So that's actually a loss of information. And those 2 mutations led to this evolution, if you will. And so I think Richard Dawkins was quite misled in his conclusions, which came out before the real data came out. But this study shows us, it gives us quite a feeling for what evolution can accomplish, what it's capable of accomplishing in quite a large number of generations. And
okay,
this guy's such a moron. My God,
he muddled what happened there, and this is something creationists do all the time.
With this
in terms of with the Lenski CIT plus line, the evolved line that could use this other nutrient citrate. It's called the CIT plus line, and creationists are constantly messing up what actually happened in this experiment. He avoided one of the major pitfalls, which is good, but then he messed up another thing. So there's several mutations that happened. It wasn't just 2. There were at least 2 that had to happen prior to the gene duplication that occurred. And then there were several mutations subsequent to that also contributed to it. The main thing is you have a gene required for citrate, it duplicates, and the second copy is expressed under new conditions. So you can express it when there's oxygen present instead of without oxygen. Now, another thing that had to happen, and he's ambiguous, so I don't know which of the 2 things he's talking about here. One option is that he's saying that second copy lost its ability to be regulated. That's wrong. That new copy of the gene was simply activated under different conditions. You can still turn it off. It was just a different set of conditions would turn it on, right? So that's a very common thing creationists say. The other thing was there's another gene that transports another sugar that's also involved in this trait, that if you don't have the other gene upregulated, then it doesn't work. And he may also be talking about that. Also not a loss of regulation. We're just expressing it at a higher level, but we don't lose the ability to turn it off. It's not what he described. I'm not sure which one he was describing there, but he was right in neither case, right? Whichever aspect, he got it wrong either way. But I don't know which one he's talking about because he doesn't specify further.
But there were other point mutations, right? It wasn't just
there
a
were,
gene mutation.
Yeah. Which, ironically, an intelligent design proponent documented a bunch of those mutations and showed directly, experimentally, repeatedly, how this trait is an irreducible trait according to Michael Behe's criteria.
Yeah, I hit that in the Behe video. Yeah, see, this is just the creationist playbook, right? They're like, okay, so some stuff can happen, but it's no new information, right, guys? Yeah. No new information. So we can't get new stuff. We can't get new species because no new information. That's basically what he's doing. He's just lying. Right.
Like, let's say we had a sequence and it was just ATA, and then you get a duplication of one of those A's. They would be like, that's no new information because it's just another A, and we already previously had an A. And it's
completely shifted the reading frame.
Yeah, right. and then you're just like, okay, well, what are we even talking about here, right? We're working with 4 base pairs, and by their logic, because those 4 base pairs existed like in the beginning, it doesn't matter how you shuffle them up. It's never new information.
I don't see any D's or L's. It's just the same letter.
Exactly, because that logic, that's just the logical conclusion of the argument that it's like, okay, if you duplicate a segment and then it gets neo-functionalized, right? So like you get a point mutation that adds a new function, like you see with the my favorite example of this is the ice fish, where you got notothenioid fish, where their ancestral population can't swim too far north or their blood freezes, and then there's a mutation in one of the genes in their blood. It duplicates, and then there's a point mutation. It's like all that happened, and then that new protein allows them, actually it might have been a little more, I think there might have been more than one point mutation, but there was a duplication, and then there were some alterations to that duplicated gene, and then their new gene has the properties of antifreeze, which allows them to swim further north, grow bigger, and populate that area with what is effectively a new species of ice fish. It's like that's literally a new protein, a de novo protein, the evolution of a protein de novo that gives the blood the property of antifreeze. If that's not evolution in the X-Man way that they're usually incorrectly talking about, I don't know what is.
They love to talk about gene duplication because it sounds like, oh, it's just a copy, it's nothing new, but they always omit the neo-functionalization, right? It's a new gene with a new protein product. They also never talk about de novo genes in the sense of a promoter being shifted to a previously non-coding region. It's like here, this isn't even starting from a copy and then neo-functionalizing. It's just a whole new gene, right? This was never a gene before, but now there's a promoter here. New gene, right? It's just they never talk about stuff like that.
They get to orphan genes towards the end, but totally butcher the whole thing.
I'm sure ready to talk about the orphan
genes. So here's what I'm going to suggest. There's another experiment here with tryptophan that's similar in some ways to the Lenski experiment. The point is they're using these 2 experiments as an illustration of the speed limit of evolution, which is silly because both of the experiments they're talking about, Lenski and the tryptophan knockout experiment, are adapting to a very specific environment. So, like, you could look at the trajectory in the Lenski experiment, you adapt to that environment, and then you stabilize in that environment, right? And you wouldn't expect a whole bunch of new things once you are optimal in that environment. You would need a dynamic environment. You would need new resources, a new predator, something new. And that's not a feature of either of these experiments. So they want to use a type of selection called stabilizing selection as an example of an evolutionary speed limit, when what they should be using is either directional or disruptive selection. It's a totally different way that evolution happens, but we don't want to talk about that because when that happens, that's how you get new traits, and we can't have that. And that allows us to jump to, I think both of you are going to have lots of thoughts.
Dan has talked a lot about the Linsky long-term evolution experiment, and you could check out his channel and some of his videos over there if you want to learn more. But suffice it to say, the long-term evolution experiment by Linsky and his colleagues has shown us how evolution occurs, like down to the little myopic details in a controlled environment for these lineages of E. coli, like how they have in fact evolved. And I think that's really interesting because this is something that Rob Stadler considers to be high confidence science.
And I need to highlight that all of that was high confidence kind of work. It's repeatable, it's directly measurable because you can sequence the DNA in the genes.
Well, now wait a second. I thought comparison of organisms was considered low confidence science, Rob.
He actually froze samples of the bacteria and you can bring them back to life and repeat the experiment. And it's prospectively studied, all those things.
So wait a minute. Let me. He when he froze them, it wasn't like he brought them back to life.
The rumors are true. I will be drinking an enormous amount of alcohol tonight, just like I did last night.
Here comes Dr. Tor with his hard-hitting fact-checking.
They were never dead.
That's right.
Brought them back to life, right? So
right.
it just goes into a dormant state.
Yes.
Correct? I just want to be sure because I didn't
exactly
think anyone
right.
ever brought something back to life. Okay.
Yeah, so
So Sadler continues and he presents a few more examples of populations of organisms like E. coli, which have been observed for long periods of time and have not evolved into something that they aren't. This, of course, requires not understanding how evolution is proposed to work, but in particular, how evolution is being modeled in these specific experiments. Like Dan noted, in the E. coli experiment, in the Linsky long-term evolution experiment, the environments aren't changing consistently over the course of these 80,000 generations to select for drastically different organisms. But Stadler seems to think that that's what we expect and that that's in fact what we expected during these specific experiments, and indeed, I guess just generally, because he brings it up with regard to lab organisms next.
Erica, it was in your notes, 41 minutes, the animals in laboratory experiments, and
yes,
if we want to talk about creationist tropes here.
Do it. I know the picture. I can see it in my head.
So this is, we're still talking about repairing stuff.
Yeah, he does a little cartoon here where he's like, see, it's not even, they're not even becoming a cow from a bacteria in the lab. They're not even doing that.
This one.
Yeah, this
here
is
we
the
go.
one.
Yep.
You know, we as a society have been studying mice for like 95 years and doing every kind of mutation imaginable. This poor little guy on the right, actually, you could see has 6 limbs. They made some mutation in the mouse that caused the gonads to become extra limbs. So they have 6 limbs. Very interesting. But the point is, after 95 years of doing that, there's 2 outcomes. You either end up with a mouse or a dead mouse, meaning that mice want to stay as mice. You know, there's nothing dramatically changing going on here. And the same has occurred for endless studies of fruit flies and zebrafish and domestic animals like your cows and your dogs and so forth. They stay within their kind. We've seen that.
A fruit fly never became a porcupine, so evolution is false. Right? This is Kent Hovind starter pack here.
It really is at that same level, right?
Yeah. And I'll add, Dan, like what you were just talking about with stabilizing selection, that applies exactly to what Stadler just said, right? Like, Rob, in which of these experiments were we trying to force a mouse to become, a bat or something like that? In which of those scenarios was that what we were trying to induce? In addition to that, a lot of those Hawk's homeobox, like body plan experiments don't result in a dead organism, right? You end up with a chicken with fingers, or you end up with a ray that has these weird duplicated body sections that functions just like a ray normally would, except it has duplicated body sections, right? You can do this in crocodiles and give them proto feathers. And you can see it in the wild as well, where, I don't know if you guys, I really like this example and I just taught it to my students, so I'm going to bring it up here. But so you have these populations of wolves in North America, right? In the northern part of North America. And their previous range has reduced to the extent that they're no longer hunting consistently in the forest are having to get a lot of their calories from fish. So they're spending a lot more time in the water than most wolves normally do. And when you take a look at these wolves, you trank one and you walk up to it and take a look at it, their paws are webbed. They have webbed feet. These wolves have, in real time, since we've been observing them, become more adapted for life in the water. And we've been observing them, Rob, for less than 95 years. That's how quickly this works when you have directional selection, right? Mm-hmm. This is a basic concept of evolution that was the foundational concept within Darwin's 5 observations when he devised the theory of evolution in the first place in the 1850s, right? It's like organisms vary and populations of organisms are competing with one another. And so if organisms vary and they exist in an environment, there's going to be differential reproductive success amongst those organisms, where the organisms that are better in that environment are going to eat more, grow bigger, and reproduce and pass those genes on. So things are going to stabilize out until the environment changes, in which case what is most fit changes. And so they will move as a population into a new direction. That variation will be selected for in a different direction. And you want to know what's wonderful about this is we can make a prediction. We can look into the rock record and look for these massive disruptions in the environment and say, we expect to see radiative evolution. We expect to see organisms evolving in all these new directions after their environment has changed drastically. Never mind that we just saw it in the present with these sea wolves, and that's what they colloquially call them. But you can do it in the past as well. And in fact, we see it every single time. Disruption in the environment, organisms go extinct or they evolve. Right? It's so simple, but Homie probably hasn't even read Origin, so whatever.
Yeah, it's actually even more deceptive than that, though, because he's fixating on this label, right? He's poo-pooing like, oh, more limbs. Okay, more limbs, slight elongation, some features change, right? No matter how, like, phenotypic change can be so significant that we would have to call it something else, yet it would still be nested under mice. Right. I don't know if mice is a family or what taxonomy you would call it, but it would just gain a more specific label at the genus or species level while retaining that phyletic, monophyletic classification. So it's everything you just said, plus being dishonest about how this terminology works, how taxonomy works. It's a mess.
And I'm going to pile on one more thing because Rob, we don't need to go in the lab to see something changing. And, can a mouse change into a non-mouse, right? Putting aside the violation of the law of monophyly that would represent, right? No need to wonder if that's possible in the lab. We can look out in nature and see these things happening in real time. And Erica went through some of the examples that I could think of. But I mean, sticking with the lab, you've got the famous 2019 paper on de novo multicellularity in a lineage of green algae that has, in its evolutionary history, no multicellularity, right? They can assemble for defense, but they can't clonally form multicellular structures. They evolve that novel trait in a durable way in the lab. We could observe
that paper all the time. It's so good.
We can observe right now in nature lizard populations transitioning from egg laying to live birth, including one of my favorite just simple ecology observational papers of all time, where in a single litter, a lizard laid 2 eggs and then gave live birth to the third.
That's so awesome.
In a single litter. And some of these lizards have placentas. And creationists have to acknowledge that the placentas evolved, because if they don't acknowledge that, they either have to assume some very improbable deletions occurred in the various lineages, or species level creation, which no young Earth creationists endorse anymore. So the lizards with placentas means lizards evolved placentas. You already mentioned the alligator feather thing. I love that one. That one's so cool. There's an amoeboid rhizarian right now. It's a unicellular eukaryote. All the members of the family are heterotrophs and they eat algae. One member of the family, Pollinella chromatophora, is undergoing primary endosymbiosis right now, right before our eyes. And not as far down the pathway because there's been less gene transfer, but there are dozens of examples of animals that are doing the same thing, that are on their way to becoming photosynthetic through secondary endosymbiosis of their algal food, including at least one example where there has been the transfer of a gene for photosynthesis into the animal genome. So that is an animal that is clearly becoming photosynthetic. This is not hypothetical. You can go out and see this happening in nature right now. You can see them eat the algae and then steal the plastids and use them, right?
And we saw the nitroplast too, right? There was that study a year or two ago, the nitroplast. It's just that, like, they refuse to acknowledge that, like, how did you go from prokaryote to eukaryote? How did you go from unicellular to multicellular? It's like, dude, we've seen all these things happen. We watch it happen. So how's that for observable? Yeah, we didn't observe it happen 2 billion years ago, but we can observe it now, so it can happen right now. So it can have happened. Yeah, it's not that hard.
Dan, do you remember this Daphnia pollex paper? So I had vaguely remembered someone talking about this Daphnia study, and I couldn't put my finger on it, but I suppose that it was either Dan or another friend of the channel, Zach Hancock, but I thought it was Dan, and so I proposed. I was like, Dan, do you remember this study? And he was like, no, I don't. And I was like, well, shoot, I don't remember it either. So I was like, I'll tell you what, I'll look into it, because I know someone's done a deep dive on it, refresh our memories while we're working on some other parts of this video. I say this in our conversation, but then we actually end up having to end relatively quickly after this, because Dave has to go, and then Dan and I didn't want to just drag on for no reason. So here I am to tell you that in the interim, I did look into this Daphnia paper, right? Because Sadler is bringing up this Daphnia study, and Daphnia is just this little type of zooplankton. It's like a tiny microscopic, it's not microscopic, it's barely visible to the naked eye, type of crustacean. Sadler's bringing it up because he's like, oh, these guys studied this population of Daphnia pollex for a long time and it didn't evolve, and so, it didn't become anything new, and so obviously evolution isn't at play. But I looked into the paper, and I was right to remember that someone had talked about it, because it turns out that the Daphnia pollex paper is also about an organism that is, like, explicitly being kept in an environment that is stable. It is just like the issues that Dan pointed out with the Lenski experiment. Evolution would not predict that these little crustaceans would evolve drastically in any way, because their environment is staying the same. There's no directional selection.
And because it's high confidence work, we can look at the DNA at the end of the road, and we can look at the DNA that we started with, make a comparison, and say what exactly has changed or evolved here. And we can have quite high confidence in what evolution can accomplish or what it can't accomplish.
Can you, Rob? Because it seems to me like the only studies that you're looking at are the studies which remove, like, the biggest force within natural selection, which is a changing environment. That's what causes organisms to move directions, as it were. That's what changes the direction of directional selection. They do bring up the COVID stuff at one point, but as Dan points out,
there's this whole section on COVID, and he's like, viruses aren't alive. I'm like, I don't care. They do evolution, whatever. We don't have to go into, I'm the virus evolution guy. We don't have to do it. It's fine. We'll
you guys can keep, I'm going to post this regardless. If you guys spill over and go, make fun of them some more, I'll still keep that.
We're going to skip the COVID stuff.
We finally move on to the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity, what was supposed to be the topic of this entire video. And Stadler says that, yes, we need to know the differences between humans and chimpanzees to start to investigate the question of how many changes would have to occur in each lineage from a common ancestor between the two groups.
Can humans and chimps have a common ancestor that evolved over, say, 6 million years? And to do that, we have to know what are the differences between humans and chimps, or the common ancestor.
Two fascinating things happen here that kind of blew my mind. The first one is that Jeffrey Tompkins does not come up. Right? So that is a huge, massive W for me, because I've been talking about how Jeffrey Tompkins' work, he's a young earth creationist who's been saying that humans and chimps are way less similar than they might have you believe for a very long time. And it seems that at long last, the number of creationists who are utilizing his number is going down. That's probably thanks in part to young earth creationist Rob Carter agreeing with me that Jeffrey Tompkins was incorrect. But the second thing that's really weird is that Stadler says that really the important thing to look at here is orphan genes.
How different are we? Looking at the DNA there, the answer lies in what's called orphan genes.
Stunning, but he elaborates, and so does the peanut gallery. So let's go there.
Here we go. Ready? Orphan genes.
Nice. And I like this summary by a New Scientist, where they said that when biologists began sequencing genomes, they discovered that up to a third of genes in each species seem to have no parents or family of any kind, meaning that they can't see a common ancestor for that gene. You know, when we talk about evolution, they always talk about the common ancestry and shared genes, but they don't tend to talk about genes that are unique. Like my kid's biology textbook, it doesn't talk about these kind of orphan genes. It doesn't mention that.
And it does.
But every living thing is carried.
Want to go?
I mean, like he's saying, well, where's the common ancestry? Yeah, what happens in that lineage after the fact, right? You get that orphan gene, and then everything that descends from that has that orphan gene. That's the point of orphan genes.
You have orphan genes at every level. They're not species specific or genus specific or family. There are these unique genes at every level in the hierarchy.
That's right. Yeah.
And he's wrong about them having no relatives. They don't have relatives as protein coding genes, but they have non-protein coding sequence homologs in related things.
And he's
we can
wrong
find
about
those and identify them.
Yeah.
It's
totally in biology textbooks.
So this is from 2013. There was a paper that came out 2 weeks ago that is the most complete genomes of apes that have been published so far, non-human apes. So earlier this year, we had the telomere to telomere, every single base pair sequenced in the human genome. That happened earlier this year. Then they're approximately 98% complete, most of these ape genomes that they've published. And they published a chimp, a bonobo, an orangutan, a gorilla, and a saimang, which is a type of gibbon. And these are like virtually complete, almost telomere to telomere sequences in most cases. So now we can get the most up-to-date comparison of humans and chimpanzees at the protein coding regions. And in the protein coding regions, they're still over maybe like 99.1 or 98.9% similar to one another, right? That means that humans and chimps share in partial or complete 99% of their genes. Right, for these are our protein coding regions. Now, with this stuff with orphan genes, this drives me absolutely up a wall because orphan genes are taxonomically restricted at the species level in the majority of cases that creationists like to appeal to, right? So they'll point to humans and chimps and they'll say they have different orphan genes. Yes, they do. So do most species that you would accept as related. The number of orphan genes that separate rats and mice, for example, is greater than the number of orphan genes that separate humans and chimps. And yet, as Dave pointed out earlier, they accept that rats and mice are related organisms. On top of that, a paper came out in 2024 that was specifically on orphan genes. And I pulled it up here because I thought that it was an interesting paper. So we can get into that later if we want. But the idea is that orphan genes are like ubiquitous. You find them all the time. They do not work to separate out their created kind. So if they want to use them as something to say, this is why humans and chimps are different from one another. Congratulations, the ark is stuffed to the gills, right? You've got too many created kinds. You're basically just appealing back to species level separate ancestry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now you have to have 6 million species on the ark if you want to go that route. Yeah.
I mean, gosh, even more than that, because we've got to consider all of the extinct species too.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
all
like
dinos,
it's everything. It's
those are fake. Those are by Satan. That's not real anyway. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's continue.
And she's probably starting with bias, right?
There's some bias there, exactly, which is dangerous.
He's so soft-spoken now. He knows his reputation as a raving lunatic, so he's like overcompensating now. I talk like this now.
I'll just say that this gets into like waiting time problem adjacent stuff. That there's math. I've done the math. It doesn't work. It's just okay.
Well, they also just don't understand what an orphan gene is. It's like, dude, it's an event, right? A promoter is translocated to another portion of the genome, and now a previously non-coding region is expressed. That's it. It's just a thing that happens, and then all of the descendants have that gene. Like, what are you not getting about what orphan genes are, you guys? Like, come on.
There's also this 2024 paper is titled "Orphan Genes Are Not a Distinct Biological Entity." So there's a lot of criticism coming out about orphan genes because orphan genes can come about by so many evolutionary processes that you can't just unite them as a single thing. It's like paraphily, but for a type of genes. You reach the same conclusion in so many ways.
Yeah, probably what I said is the main mechanism, but there are others, I assume.
Right.
Yeah,
there's so many.
Yeah, to your point, though. Like, that's the problem. It's like what you're talking about is true, but then there's also so many other ways to get orphan genes that calling them a single thing just isn't very helpful. It's not it's not like useful.
I think that should make people wonder if, in fact, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's not a God of the gaps argument. This is an argument from what we know evolution is capable of and what it's not capable of.
And I just want to again say what he's using there is the Lenski experiment as a speed limit, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
So can I ask you something about this? If you go back to that 6% slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hold there for a second, because and tell me if I'm speaking low confidence information or if I'm speaking high confidence. This report came out in 2006. Then he's writing it in his book, which came out in 2009. So there's a 3-year gap there, not much. It takes at least a year to get a book published. But since then, in the last 19 years since then, hasn't that 6.4% gone way up? In other words, through Project ENCODE, there's a lot more discovery that many do not have orthologs. Or am I wrong on that?
We're going to talk about this more later. You're going to hear us talk about it more later. But James Tour is just so out of his depth here. He is confusing the comparative genomics of humans and chimpanzees with the ENCODE project. Those are two completely separate creationist arguments that he is mixing up. With regard to the human and chimpanzee genomic similarity, the percent similarity when we look at the entirety of the genome, taking into account the types of mutations, has not dropped from 95-96% since 2005. In fact, the protein coding similarities have gone up. I just think that Dr. Tor is confused about the ENCODE arguments that creationists use, which is that junk DNA is completely a myth, the human-chimp genomic similarity arguments that creationists use, which usually come from Jeffrey Tompkins and have been on their way out thanks to work by myself, Glenn Williamson, and ironically, creationist Rob Carter, as well as the minutia of that previous topic. The differences between humans and chimps in protein coding regions, whole genome, or just root raw nucleotide by nucleotide comparison. And all of those numbers are different, but it doesn't matter which number you use. It doesn't matter how you compare it. Humans and chimpanzees are always going to turn out as more similar to one another than other pairs of organisms that young Earth creationists accept and in fact insist are related, like rats and mice, or lions and tigers, or African and Asian elephants.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of controversy in settling on a number here. And some would argue that it's extremely hard to quantify the difference.
Hey, Erica, you know anybody who's tried to settle on a number recently?
Can I just, I'm going to toot my own horn here for a second. This is my fault in part. What he's talking about there is my fault. If this video had come out 2 years ago, he'd be saying the most recent numbers by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins are saying humans and chimps are only 85% similar. But he's not saying that anymore because I roasted Jeffrey Tompkins so consistently because I hate the work that he's done and because it's so faulty. And it wasn't just me. It was others like people on Peaceful Science and Glenn Williamson, who's a computer programmer and things of that nature.
And Dr. Rob Carter.
I was going to say, we did it so loudly and so consistently that another young Earth creationist, Dr. Rob Carter, wanted to debunk me, So he started looking into this, for himself. And then he was like, yeah, Tompkins is wrong on this. Every single paper that he's done is wrong. Humans and chimps are not 85% similar. It's a lot higher than that. And that's a direct quote. Side note, I actually rewatched it. And what he says is it's going to be higher than that. Not it's a lot higher than that. Just being clear, right? He's like, it's way higher than you think. So now the creationist community is in a bit of a tailspin because they can't use Tompkins' number because Rob Carter, another young Earth creationist who has way more robustly checked this work, has come out and been like, no, Tompkins is wrong. He's
updated their script.
Yeah, they updated their script, right? And you're going to see that again with these new Great Ape genomes that have come out because this is going to be really problematic for them. They're going to have to find a way to spin it. And I have thoughts on how they're already spinning it. But can we just appreciate how James Tour does not know what comparative genomics is or what ENCODE is?
No idea.
And
he goes correctly.
He's reading something. He doesn't know what he's asking even.
He's like, you can tell me if I'm wrong. You're wrong. ENCODE has absolutely nothing to do with the human chimpanzee genomic comparison. These aren't just separate projects. They're separated by many, many years. The human and chimpanzee comparison was done initially in 2005, and they came to that 96% for the full genome. That has maintained itself throughout the years. When you take into consideration the types of mutations that are occurring, it's 99% for coding base pairs. For the full genome, it's about 96%. That number is still consistent. Pretty much everybody, including most creationists now, like even young Earth creationists, agree that that is the number. ENCODE is a completely different thing that has to do with the functionality of the genome. Dan, that's your thing.
Yeah, so ENCODE is garbage mostly. So they're looking at function of the human genome, and they define function as any biochemical activity, excluding for some reason DNA replication. They didn't count that, but any other biochemical activity, because if you include replication, then the whole genome is functional because the whole genome is replicated, right? So any other biochemical activity, they said, is indicative of function in a very famous 2012 paper that every creationist and the grandmother has read and committed to memory. And then they revised their position in a less famous 2014 paper that every creationist refuses to read, because in the 2014 paper, many of the same authors described the criteria for DNA that would be non-functional. They described it as not having purifying selection, or having a very low level of transcription or protein binding. And if you check all of those boxes, then it's probably not functional. And then you dig into their data in that exact paper, and most of the genome is in what you would categorize according to their own criteria as non-functional. And which is to say it has no selected function. It doesn't do a job that has been selected for and maintained through evolutionary history, right? And so they're going to do the basic like creationist talking points around the genome is mostly functional. We used to think it was all junk. I'll just play just a second here, because they do the thing that tells me they don't know anything about this. They're just repeating the talking points.
I actually got to hop off here, but I know what they're going to say.
You know exactly what they're going to say, Dave. You know this.
We used to think it was junk, and now it's not. All of it is not junk. Okay, it's 2% coding, and then up to like 10% has regulatory function. That's about it. The rest is junk.
Dan, if you can stick around for a couple minutes, we can just do it. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, you guys feel free to keep roasting. I'm going to repost this, and then pretty soon I'm going to start working on a nice, lengthy little series on Tour and all the crap he's been saying lately, because it's time to hit this clown again. But this was fun to kind of like warm back up to it. It's got me excited to tear through all of his content. But thanks, guys. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
But
okay, Dan.
Let's just play this line. Dave, he was right. He knows exactly what they're going to say, right? Everybody watching, you know what they're going to say.
I'm going to get to the punchline with Dan here in a minute, but first I want to go back and touch on a couple of other things that James Tour said before he gets to this point where he's going to insist that we've been finding out every year that the genome is more and more and more functional than we previously thought, and actually there's no such thing as junk DNA, because Tour is going to say a lot of stuff here in a second about like the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity, and he's going to reveal his ignorance on the subject, despite titling the video as he titled it, despite picking the attention grabber that he picked, despite making that concept sort of the centerpiece of this video. He has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. Let's take a look.
And so, again, correct me if I'm wrong, my numbers may not be up to date, but if we were... Of our protein coding genes, the ones that code for proteins, that's what people used to speak about when they said that we are 98.5% the same as a chimpanzee.
So the genome is very big. It's like 3.2 billion base pairs long for humans and like 3.8 billion base pairs long for chimpanzees. And in both of us, the protein coding regions, or the regions of the genome that are functional, that do the big stuff, that accounts for about 2% of each genome. In those regions, the very important regions, right, we are about 99% similar to chimpanzees. It's actually gone up from that 98.8% that James Tour is getting at there. When you take the entire genome into account, and when you take into account the types of mutations that are at play in the entire genome, humans and chimpanzees are about 95-96% similar. It drops from 99 to 95-96. The same is true regardless of which pair of organisms you're looking at. The protein coding regions are always going to be more similar than the entire genome is, whether you're comparing a human and a human and a chimp, a human and a gorilla, a human and a macaque, a rat and a mouse, a lion and a tiger, or an African and an Asian elephant. Tor is about to paint this very differently. He considers it in a conspiratorial light, and I'm not sure if it's because he's just ignorant on the subject or if he's doing it intentionally, but he paints this as if scientists intentionally are obscuring the non-coding regions of the genome so that they can artificially inflate the number and the similarity between humans and chimps. Now, as I said earlier, that is just not true. The 2005 paper that gives the 95-96% number is ubiquitous in conversations about comparative genomics. There's no trickery here, and that's why you'll usually find both of those numbers in tandem. It's why I present them both at every opportunity.
But they discounted what they called junk DNA. That has gotten a new term. The junk DNA is no longer called junk because people have seen it's not junk. It's called intergenic DNA. And that DNA, that intergenic DNA, it was believed didn't have any real function because they weren't protein coding genes. But it turns out that they have regulatory function, and a good portion of that 98.5% of the DNA in us turns out to have regulatory function. I don't know what percentage.
We know. I think what he's getting at here is that if you take away the 2% of the genome that is protein coding and look at the non-protein coding regions, that it's not all junk DNA, and some of it does in fact serve a function, and a lot of it performs regulatory functions. That's all fine and good. The comparison between humans and chimpanzees, taking the entire genome and the types of mutations into account, is 95 to 96%. Like, we're taking that stuff into account, James. It's not being put to the side. It's not being ignored.
I thought you had said as much as 30%, which would mean it's much more content than the protein coding genes, which is very different than that of a chimpanzee between a human.
Nope, you're whiffing this one, Dr. Tor. You're getting it wrong, right? The non-coding DNA is included in those whole genome comparisons, and that number is 95 to 96%. I don't know where he's talking about this 30% is actually extremely different number. And if you have a source for that, James, I would love to see it. Personally, I think James Tor might need to consider switching Robs with regard to his comparative genomics consultation, going from Rob Stadler to the superior Robert Carter, who has done a lot of legwork on this human and chimpanzee genomic similarity. You should reach out to him, Dr. Tor. He's a young Earth creationist just like you. Ask him how similar he thinks humans and chimpanzees are. Ask him if he thinks it's 85%.
Am I getting this right, or am I functioning on outdated knowledge?
I wish this knowledge was just outdated, Dr. Tor. The knowledge that you're using is jumbled. There have been a lot of mutations in it, deletions, duplications, frame shifts. Now, Rob Stadler is not going to correct Tor on this. Instead, he's just going to agree that, yes, the protein coding regions account for about 2% of the genome. He's not going to touch the rest of it.
No, I believe the protein coding genes are only 1 or 2% of our complete DNA.
Yes.
So the rest of it, the 98% that isn't coding for proteins directly, used to be considered junk. And now we recognize that that's really where the treasure is. And that's where a lot of the differences exist between humans and chimps.
Oh, really, Dr. Stadler? A lot of the differences? Like what percent would you say? Like maybe if you were to compare the whole genomes and include those non-coding regions, of course, that number might be what, like 95, 96%? Like maybe the percent difference would be like 4 to 5%, you think? Now, I think that the reason why they're vague on the actual number is because they're hoping that creationists will watch this and they'll be like, whoa, it's lower than 99%, and they'll accept sort of this conspiratorial pill and just follow that rabbit trail to wherever their heart desires, right? They'll be like, well, it must be way lower, like 50% even. Maybe humans and chimps are only like 50% similar. But it's like, we have the number. The numbers are out there. They're especially out there now that the most complete ape genomes have been sequenced, and those were just published again last week. You'll get more videos from me about that subject here soon. But the reason why I'm sort of harping on this conspiracy angle is because that's the angle that James Tor is taking. Listen to him crash out.
Yes. So we gotta be clear here, Rob. This is where the whole thing blows open. I mean, the whole thing where people have said we are 99%, 98.5% the same as a chimpanzee. That's only when you're looking at less than 2% of the DNA. that's in our bodies. When you look at the other 98% of our DNA that's in our bodies, you see vast differences between us and the chimpanzee.
Nope, you really don't, Dr. Tor. You do see differences because humans and chimpanzees are different species, but the differences that you see are less than the differences between pairs of organisms that I know you accept as related. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the protein coding regions, 98.8% similar between humans and chimps, and it's actually gone up to higher than 99%. Or you can take into account the entire genome, all of that non-coding DNA that you love to just talk about there, Dr. Tor. You can take it all into account and the number will be about 95 to 96% similar. It doesn't matter if you're just looking at the protein coding regions or if you're looking at the whole thing, the percent similarity between humans and chimpanzees is always going to be higher than the percent similarity between other pairs of organisms that I know you accept as related, like lions and tigers, African and Asian elephants, or rats and mice. And before you get too excited, this even holds if you do a brute nucleotide by nucleotide comparison between any given pair of organisms, which is maximizing differences. You are still going to end up with humans and chimpanzees being more similar than lions and tigers, or two types of elephants, or rats and mice. And I know, because I asked Richard Buggs that question. But James Tor doesn't know any of this. He is not aware of the literature. He has not even done a cursory Google search on the subject, evidently, because he goes on to paint this, the difference between the protein coding genomic similarity between humans and chimps and the whole genome percent similarity, which he does not know, he doesn't actually know that number, as a great big conspiracy.
And so it was like this secret that just got exposed through ENCODE. And at first they thought, oh, well, okay, I'll give you a little bit. But it turns out again and again, and each year they were finding more and more among the intergenic, the formerly called junk DNA, that has this regulatory function. So these are the traffic cops that allow things to go and not go. And so this is what turns on, and we're so different. And so people need to realize this. Science changes, and then this being translated to the general public becomes much, much less. People don't want to talk about this with the general public because then we become wise to this, that, hey, you know, the things that you taught us, the things that you said really don't have as much substance anymore.
Like, my God, one more, and I'm right, I swear I can feel it, I'm right there, I'm on the precipice.
Good Lord, I sure hope that Robert Carter is aware of this nonsense, because poor Rob Carter is already fighting an uphill battle getting creationists to accept that the percent similarity between humans and chimps is much higher than Jeffrey Tompkins would have you believe. But if he knew that James Tor is out here peddling a conspiracy that scientists were trying to downplay the differences between humans and chimps in the non-coding regions, he would probably fall off his kayak. Gosh, especially to hear the resident expert for young earth creationists on abiogenesis getting this so thoroughly wrong across the board, whether we're talking about ENCODE or the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity. Bad show, James Tor. And then James Tor says that comparing genomic sequences between organisms is high-confidence science.
And what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with high-confidence material because we can actually record the DNA. This isn't a bunch of speculation. We can see the regulation. Am I right on this, Rob?
Now, if I recall correctly from Dr. Sadler's slide, that's actually low-confidence science, comparing organisms and their similarity. So, you know, maybe we should pick a lane, boys. So Stadler and Tor start talking about a different number. Now they're talking about the percent of genes that are found in humans that are not found in chimpanzees, that do not have orthologs in chimpanzees. So now we're back to talking about the coding regions, but we're also talking about a very old paper on the subject, something that James Tor points out and then incorrectly proposes that ENCODE, again, this is the junk DNA organization, not the human-chimpanzee comparison organization, that ENCODE is the group that is finding that number is higher than they might have you believe. It's insane.
No, but also you're not being fair, Rob. You're not being as hard on these people as they deserve, because you're saying 6%. That's a number from 2006. In the last 19 years, I think there's been a lot more that's been exposed. Now, I may be wrong on that, but I think that Project ENCODE is finding more and more in the last almost 20 years. And so that number of 6%, you're being very gracious. You're not being fair in telling us that number is probably actually much higher.
I got a fucking headache, and I don't feel good at all.
Neither of these men have kept up to date at all on the comparative genomics between humans and other apes. Again, humans and chimpanzees are 99% similar. They share 99% of their genes. And in the most recent Ape Genomes paper, there's a quote in there that I'm waiting on a reply from the authors of the paper, but to my understanding, over 99% of human genes are found either partially or completely in the other apes. And the way that those protein coding genes are shared across these apes recapitulates the same usual ape phylogeny, the same one that we've had since that 2006 paper. So to my understanding then, the number of protein coding genes that humans and chimpanzees share, it just keeps going up.
Do I have that right? Again, I'm not an expert in this. I'm deferring to you.
Yeah, James, we know, but actually, Stadler's not an expert either. He's demonstrated that in this presentation, and also just his background demonstrates that. That doesn't mean that you guys can't have this conversation or express your opinion on the topic. Obviously, it doesn't mean that. But when so many basic mistakes are being made so consistently throughout this presentation and talk as a whole, I think that gives people a reasonable case to just kind of be skeptical about anything that the two of you guys have to say. So let's round this off with Dan and I's conclusion with regard to James Tour's misunderstanding of how the ENCODE project actually works. Tour thinks that ENCODE has just discovered that overwhelmingly junk DNA is a myth, and this idea that most of the human genome doesn't do anything in particular, that idea has just been taken out back and curb stomped.
Okay, here's the thing with this, folks. There has never been a point in history ever where we thought all non-protein coding DNA was junk. Okay? There are functions in that DNA like promoters, kind of an important thing, promoters, tRNA, that were discovered before the term junk DNA is defined in the peer-reviewed literature, right? So clearly there was never a point where we thought all non-protein coding DNA was junk. That's never been a thing. And the fact that we're in the year of our Lord 2025 still saying that tells me that these two are they're just doing the regular creationist misinformation on this, and I don't want to make a judgment as to whether they are buying or selling, but they are just, it's the same old.
It's honestly worse than that too, because this is like the regurgitated of the regurgitated of the regurgitated of the, like, we're looking at almost like a human centipede, but at the very tail end here of this repeated talking point. And it's evident by the way that Tor thinks this has anything to do with the human chimpanzee genomic similarity. You just heard him say it. He says he's talking about how, it used to be 95%, but as we've continued to sequence this junk DNA, that number has gone down. The 96% number was including all the junk DNA.
Yeah,
Dr. Tor. That's where that number comes from. It's 98.8% from that initial protein coding region. Then in the next subsequent paper looked at the whole genome, taking into account the types of mutations, and that's where you get that 95-96% from. So that's including all the junk DNA that had been sequenced at that time period, junk, quote unquote, the non-coding DNA that had been sequenced at that time period, right? Now, since then, we've got the telomere to telomere full human genome. There is nary a base pair unsequenced. And we almost have that for chimpanzees too. And the number is still where it's always been. It's still where it's always been. I don't know how you could host a talk like this and not know the difference between ENCODE and between the human and chimp genomic similarity. It's unconscionable to be talking about that at this point.
This part, so up to that point, a lot of it was very typical creationist stuff, but that was something I genuinely never seen before. The conflation of these things in just a completely what are we doing? I'm speechless. Just how could somebody who this is their thing not understand how those two things do and don't go together, right?
Right. And Dan, if you would please, like, can we go to when, because Tor's going to go on, do you remember when he goes on like that rant about this, where he's like, the scientists were lying about the human chimp genome, but he's also kind of talking about ENCODE.
It's all jumbled up in here. It's a big giant mess. All right, so this last clip we want to show is the perfect companion to the bit we just showed with them massively misunderstanding ENCODE and human chimp stuff. This part is the perfect cherry on top to that.
And this is what you're talking about today. I mean, I didn't know anything about origin of life studies 7 or 8 years ago, and I learned about it. And one day I might step in the evolution waters and take that down too. But right now I'll leave it to you, and I'll just build upon this. But I think one of the topics that I want you to talk about for.
Okay. That's perfect.
He's going to take it down too.
I don't have any.
He's going to come in and take it down too. Please, Dr. Tor, do it. I want you to do it. I want you to spend as much time as you spent on Origin of Life, and I want you to spend it on evolution, because the group of people that covers evolution here on YouTube is a lot larger than the group that covers abiogenesis and Origin of Life. And then you won't just have to contend with, Dave coming for you. We can all come for you. We can all just at the same time, we can come dunk on you for this, because I'm not optimistic about where that's going to go. I don't think that he has done his due diligence on any of this at all. He's content to let Rob just talk to his heart's content, and he sits there and he kind of nods. It's very Joe Rogan-esque in that way, actually. Where
that's a good observation. Yeah. But then Rob's wrong about a bunch of stuff too, because he doesn't have the background.
Yeah.
In terms of things like the Lenski experiment or common ancestry with humans and chimps and sequence similarity and ENCODE, because you'll notice Rob didn't correct him on any of that stuff.
That's actually a great point, and I don't give Dan credit for that point in this conversation. But yeah, like, why didn't Rob Stadler correct James Tor on any of those monumental flubs?
It's not great. Yes. It's not great. Dr. Tor, James, please do evolution next.
The rest of their video doesn't really cover anything of substance. Stadler just concludes that the evidence supports the forest of life over the tree of life, and, they plug their various opinions and talk about how microevolution is different from macroevolution, which it isn't. Not mechanistically, at least. They're just occurring at different time scales. Dan and I go back and forth and talk about how James Tor is, in fact, a young Earth creationist, which is the lens by which we view this entire presentation, and also James Tor in general. That in and of itself disqualifies him from being taken seriously within the scientific community, unless he is coming with some serious data, some serious analyses. And he's not. So since we knew that Dave was going to be re-uploading this, we sign off. I'm like, I'm Gutsickgibbon. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate in biological anthropology. And then Dan does his spiel, and I'm going to let it play because I love Dan.
And I'm Dan. I'm an evolutionary biologist. My channel is Creation Myths, and I do on there the kind of stuff that we did here. So if you want to hear about why, genetic related and evolution related creationist nonsense is super nonsense, come check my stuff out. And you know what? I'm just going to do some shameless self-promotion here. As we sit here recording this, I'm this close to 10,000 subscribers. I have this piddly little channel. Come on, folks, get me over the hump. Thanks, everybody.
At the end of the day, if I had to describe my feelings towards this presentation by Stadler and James Tor, but especially James Tor's opinions and sort of quips on evolution here, I would say that I am unimpressed. I'm actually extremely let down by this showing. I know James Tor can do better than this, and I think that he did very little preparation, and it's very clear that he knows very little about evolution as a subject, which is why I'm just so excited by the prospect that he might wade into that pool. I mean, Dave has really been doing much of the legwork with this abiogenesis stuff, and that's the bulk of what James Tor has been railing against. But I think that he will find that if he broadens his horizon a little bit and starts talking more about his skepticism towards evolution, that he won't just be busted up by Professor Dave and the experts that he calls in. He will be eviscerated by a dozen people, each themselves experts in the fields that they talk about. And that will be in addition to Professor Dave, who will continue to dunk on James Tor. The group of people who bust pseudoscientists who tried to deny evolutionary theory, that is a very big tent. And I am thrilled by the prospects that James Tour may be paying us a visit. Anyways, my gentle, of course, very modern apes, thank you so much for being here with me today. If you like what I do on this channel, please consider supporting me the free way by liking, commenting, and subscribing. It's no skin off your nose, really, but it helps me greatly with regard to the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to support me in a more financial way, you can do that by joining my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos when I'm on top of things, and they get their names at the ends of videos. So I wanted to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and, of course, very modern heart for being here and for being such a curious primate. I'll see you next time.